This is our second recorded lecture for English 90. Our topic in this lecture will be an introduction to MLA In-Text Citation, and we'll focus on articles written by entities. If you have not done so already, please go to the D2L content page and print out the prep packet for MLA In-Text Citation, Introduction and Articles by Entities. You'll need to complete that prep packet during the course of this lecture. You'll also need to submit the completed prep packet in our next class so you can earn credit for having viewed this lecture. Please pause the video to do that now. Before we can begin talking about citation, we need to have a topic. The topic I've chosen is diversity in colleges, but that's way too broad, it's too big. If I type that in on an internet search engine, it would pull up millions and millions of different source options. So I'm going to narrow that topic down to 3 main points. My first main point is colleges are diverse because our society is diverse. My next main point is colleges need to address diversity conflicts. And my last main point is diversity needs to be a priority at all colleges. Depending on the length of your paper, you may need to have fewer or more main points to fill up the page numbers. So if you have a 5-page essay to write, you'll probably need 5 main points. So let's look at sources and citation. Sources are books, articles, videos that students use to support their ideas when they're writing an academic essay. In essence, sources are evidence that students use to write their papers, to support their ideas. Once a student has found a book or a video to quote from or summarize from, the student has to give the author of that video, the author of that book, credit for those ideas. Whenever you give an author credit, you're citing the author. There are 2 types of citation. The first type is in-text citation, which we'll be focusing on in this lecture. And the next type is a works cited, which is unique to MLA. We'll focus on works cited in a different video. Please look at your prep packet. Number 1 asks, what is a source? Number 2 asks, what are 2 types of citation? You can use this slide to answer that question. Pause the video to do that now. So we have our narrow topic. Colleges need to address diversity conflicts. When I went on the internet and I typed that into the search option, I came up with these 2 sources that are useful for me. Both of these sources are web articles written by entities. An entity is a collective functioning as a whole, and an example of an entity is a government agency or an association or committee. Number 3 of your prep packet asks, what is an entity? You can write down this exact definition to answer number 3. Pause the video to do that now. So what is in-text citation? In-text citation is when you cite or reference an author's ideas within the body of your essay. Pause the video now to answer number 4 of your prep packet. Here's an example of a sentence I used from one of my web sources. Now remember, these are articles written by an entity. This particular article didn't have any page numbers, and I'm not going to mention the entity name in the body of the sentence. So let me put a box around the in-text citation so you can see what it is. So the sentence I used a direct quote from the web page, from the article, and that sentence reads, the Census Bureau projects that by the year 2100, the U.S. minority population will become the majority, with non-Hispanic whites making up only 40% of the U.S. population. If you'll notice, I closed the quotation mark right after population. That means I ended the quote from that article. I put a space, then I put an open parentheses in front of the word great. That means I'm about to begin my in-text citation. So open parentheses. In this case, it's an article written by an entity, not a person. So I put the entity name, Great Schools, and I have to capitalize it. Then I close parentheses and I put a period. That's your first way to use in-text citation. You put the in-text citation in parentheses at the end of the sentence. Please notice that the period comes after the closed parentheses, not before. not after population, but after the closed parentheses, after the in-text citation. For number 5 of your prep packet, I want you to write down exactly this example. Everything I have boxed should be boxed on your prep packet. Everything I have labeled should be labeled. You can pause the video to do that now. Here's our second example of in-text citation. Again, we're using articles by entities. This came from a different website, but there still aren't any page numbers. But I'm going to mention the entity name in the actual sentence. So let's put a box around my in-text citation here. And I wrote in my essay, according to College Board advocacy, concerns around race, ethnicity, and gender in education have reemerged on our national landscape. So because I mentioned the name of the entity within the actual sentence, I have done my in-text citation. I've given the entity credit for the information about race, ethnicity, and gender in that sentence. Please look at number 6 of your prep packet. It asks for you to give an example of an article written by an entity, no page numbers, entity mentioned in the sentence. Write what you see on this slide exactly as you see it. Make certain you box College Board advocacy and label it in-text citation within sentence. You can pause the video to do that now. Now let's look at some techniques for quoting. The first technique is a direct quote, and that means writing the author's words verbatim without any changes. Go to number 7 of your prep packet and use this slide to answer it. Pause the video to do that now. Here's an example of a direct quote. Open quotation mark. The Census Bureau projects that by the year 2100, the U.S. minority population will become the majority, with non-Hispanic whites making up 40% of the U.S. population. Close quotation mark. Space, open parentheses, great schools, close parentheses, period. This is our direct quote. When you make a direct quote, you should use the author's words verbatim. Every word that the author capitalized, every piece of punctuation. If the author used numbers, you write it exactly as it is. A common mistake students make is that they don't realize that they've changed the author's words, even though they're using quotations. So for number 8, where it asks for an example of a direct quote, I want you to write down exactly what you see on this slide. Write the direct quote, box it, label it author's words verbatim, make certain you include the in-text citation, open parentheses, great schools, close parentheses, period. You can pause the video to do that now. Now let's look at another technique for quoting. You can use a partial quote. That's when you use some of the author's words and some of your own words, but you don't change the overall meaning. For number 9 of your prep packet, what is a direct quote? Pause the video and answer that question using this slide. Now here's an example of a partial quote. I wrote, according to College Board advocacy, concerns around race, ethnicity, and gender in education have reemerged on our national landscape. Let's look at the original quote. The original quote read, issues associated with race, ethnicity, and gender in education have reemerged on our national landscape. The words I used from there, I've put in a box. Those are the author's words. I found these words to be the most useful for my paper. So now let's look at my partial quote. My words in the partial quote are, according to, and then of course I have College Board advocacy, that's the name of the entity. But instead of using issues associated with race, I used concerns around race. So according to, concerns around, those are my words. And then I started the quote in the middle of the sentence. That's why you see those 3 little periods in front of the word race. After the quotation marks, in front of the word race, you have 3 little periods. Those are called ellipses, which you don't need to remember. But you do need to remember that when you take a sentence from the author's article, from the author's book, or if you take it mid-sentence from a video, you have to use those three little dots to let the author or the reader, know that you're taking the sentence only partially from the original sentence. Now for number 10, it asks that you give an example of a partial quote. I want you to write down, according to College Board advocacy, concerns around race, ethnicity, and gender in education have reemerged in our national landscape. I want you to write that down exactly as is written. Make sure you punctuate it perfectly, and make sure you box everything I have boxed and labeled everything I have labeled. You can pause the video to do that now. So that's the end of our MLA In-Text Citation, Introduction and Articles by Entities video. If you need to go back and rewind to make certain that all your answers look exactly as they looked on the video, please do that. This is just your little introduction. When we do group work in our next class, you'll actually have to apply everything that you've learned in this lecture. So thanks for listening.